American history, as taught in American schools and universities, typically begins with Christopher Columbus' voyage to the Americas in 1492, or with Native American prehistory. However, in recent decades, Native American prehistory has become increasingly popular as the starting point for American history. View 1. Indigenous people lived in what is now the United States before European colonists began arriving, mostly from Great Britain, after 1600. By the 1770s, the 13 colonies numbered over 2 million people. The colonies prospered and grew, rapidly developing their own independent legal and political systems. The British Parliament imposed its authority on the colonies by imposing new taxes that the Americans considered unconstitutional because they had no representation in Parliament. Increasing conflicts escalated into all-out war beginning in 1775. On July 4, 1776, the colonies declared their independence from Great Britain in a document written by Thomas Jefferson and became the United States of America. The Patriots, with substantial financial and military support from France and under the military leadership of General George Washington, won the Revolutionary War, and peace was achieved in 1783. During and after the war, the 13 states united into a weak federal government through the Confederate Constitution. When the Confederate Constitution proved inadequate, a new constitution was adopted in 1789. This remained the basis of the United States government and later included the Bill of Rights. A strong national government was established with Washington as the first president and Alexander Hamilton as chief financial advisor. During the first party system, two national political parties formed to support or oppose Hamilton's policies. When Thomas Jefferson became president, he purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, doubling the size of the United States. A second and final war with Britain occurred in 1812. The main result of this war was the end of European support for Native American Indian attacks against settlers in the American West. Under the auspices of the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian movements, the United States expanded into the Louisiana Purchase and all the way to California and Oregon, seeking cheap land for yeoman farmers and slaveholders who promoted democracy and territorial expansion at the cost of violence and contempt for European culture. This territorial expansion under the guise of manifest destiny was a rejection of the Whig Party's advice to promote economic and social depth and modernization rather than mere geographical expansion. Slavery was abolished in all northern states, north of the Mason-Dixon line dividing Pennsylvania and Maryland by 1804, but flourished in the southern states because of the great demand for cotton from Europe. After 1820, a series of compromises helped to ease the confrontation between the North and the South over the issue of slavery. By the mid-1850s, the newly formed Republicans took control of northern politics and promised to prevent the spread of slavery, with the implication that slavery would eventually be phased out. The election of Republican Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 sparked the secession of 11 slave states to form the Confederate States of America in 1861. The American Civil War, 1861-1865, is central to American history. After 4 years of bloody fighting, the North, led by President Lincoln and General Ulysses S. Grant, defeated the South, led by General Robert E. Lee. The Union was preserved and slavery abolished, and the South was devastated. During the Reconstruction era, 1863-1877, the United States ended slavery and extended voting and legal rights to freed people, African Americans who had previously been slaves. The national government became stronger, and thanks to the 14th Amendment, it now had a clear mandate to protect individual rights. Reconstruction ended in 1877, and from the 1890s to the 1960s, Jim Crow laws kept blacks in a position of economic, social, and political inferiority. The entire South remained impoverished until the second half of the 20th century, while the North and West grew rapidly and prospered. The United States became the world's leading industrial power at the turn of the 20th century, thanks to a boom in private enterprise in the North and the immigration of millions of workers and farmers from Europe. The national railroad system was completed. Factories and large-scale mining operations industrialized the Northeast and Midwest. Middle-class dissatisfaction with corruption, inefficiency, and traditional politics fueled a radical movement from the 1890s to the 1920s that pressed for reforms, including women's suffrage and prohibition of alcohol, which was eventually repealed in 1933. The United States was initially neutral in World War I, but declared war on Germany in 1917 and financed the victorious Allies the following year. After a decade of prosperity in the 1920s, the Wall Street stock market crash of 1929 marked the beginning of a decade-long worldwide Great Depression. Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt became president and implemented relief, reconstruction, and reform programs, collectively known as the New Deal, which shaped modern American liberalism. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States entered World War II on the side of the Allies and helped defeat Nazi Germany in Europe and Imperial Japan in the Far East. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers after World War II and initiated a Cold War in directly confronting each other in the arms race and the space race. U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War was built around containing communism, and the United States entered the wars in Korea and Vietnam to achieve this goal. Liberalism achieved numerous victories during the New Deal years and then in the mid-1960s, especially with the success of the civil rights movement. But conservatism turned the tables in the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan. The Cold War ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, leaving the United States as the sole remaining superpower. As the 21st century began, international conflict centered around the Middle East and reached a fever pitch following the September 11th attacks and the subsequent declaration of the War on Terror. The United States experienced its worst economic recession since World War II in the late 2000s, followed by a period of slower than normal economic growth throughout the 2010s. Prehistoric Econ. This section is empty. You can help by developing a Bobo, February 2025. Pre-Columbian. It is not known exactly how or when Native Americans first settled in the Americas and the territory that is now the United States. The most common theory is that the natives migrated from Eurasia across Beringia, a land bridge that then connected Siberia to what is now Alaska, and then dispersed southward across the Americas. This migration may have begun about 30,000 years ago, Trudeau, and continued until 10,000 years ago, when the land bridge was below sea level due to the end of the last ice age. 3. These early inhabitants, known as Paleo-Americans, soon diversified into hundreds of peoples and tribes with distinct cultures. The pre-Columbian period is the collective term for all the subperiods of the history and prehistory of the Americas before significant European influence on the continent, spanning from the initial settlement in the late Stone Age to the European colonization of the Americas in the early modern period. Although this period is often referred to as the period before the expeditions of Christopher Columbus from 1492 to 1504, the term usually includes the history of the indigenous cultures of the Americas up until they were conquered or significantly influenced by Europeans, even if this occurred decades or even centuries after Columbus's first landing. Colonial period. The Spanish conquistador Coronado explored many places in the American Southwest from 1540 to 1542. After a period of exploration sponsored by major European nations, the first European settlements were established in 1607. 4. Europeans brought horses, cattle, and pigs to the Americas, and in return they brought back to Europe corn, turkeys, potatoes, beans, and squash. The disease-ridden environment was fatal to many explorers and early settlers who were exposed to new diseases. The effects of the new diseases were even worse for the Native Americans, especially smallpox and measles. They died in great numbers, often before large-scale European settlements were established. Therapy 6. Colonization by the Spanish, Dutch, and French. The first Europeans to reach what is now the United States were Spanish explorers, the second expedition of Christopher Columbus. This voyage reached Puerto Rico on November 19, 1493. Another reached Florida in 1513. Twice, soon after, Spanish expeditions reached the Appalachian Mountains, the Mississippi River, the Grand Canyon, 8, and the Great Plains. In 1540, Hernando de Soto made a large-scale expedition to the Ayur southeast. Also in 1540, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado explored from Arizona to central Kansas. 9. The Spanish brought some settlers, establishing the first permanent European settlement in the continental United States at present-day St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565. But the settlement attracted few permanent settlers. Spanish settlements grew and became important cities, including Santa Fe, Albuquerque, San Antonio, Tucson, San Diego, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, and San Francisco. 10. Areas claimed by European nations in North America circa 1750. France, UK, Spain, New Netherland was a 17th century Dutch colony centered on what is now New York City and the Hudson River Valley, where they traded furs with Native Americans to the north and served as a defense against English-speaking encroachments from New England. The Dutch were Calvinists who founded the Reformed Church in America, but also assimilated other cultures and religions. The colony was conquered by the English in 1664. It left an enduring legacy on American political and cultural life, including a liberal secularism and utilitarianism in the cities, a rural traditionalism in the countryside, characterized by the short story Rip Van Winkle, and politicians such as Martin Van Buren, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt. 11. New France was colonized by the French from 1534 to 1763. There were few permanent settlers outside of Quebec and Acadia, but the Wabanaki Confederacy became military allies of New France during 4 wars with British colonies associated with the Iroquois Confederacy. During the French and Indian Wars, New England successfully fought against Acadia. The British expelled the Acadians of French origin from Acadia, Nova Scotia, and replaced them with settlers from New England. 12. Gradually, some Acadians resettled in Louisiana, where they developed a distinct rural Cajun culture that still exists today. They became American citizens in 1803 when the United States purchased Louisiana from France. 13. Other French villages along the Mississippi and Illinois rivers disappeared as Americans began arriving after 1770. 14. British colonization. The Mayflower carried people seeking religious freedom to the New World. During the first winter at Plymouth, about half of the crew died. 15. The strip of land along the eastern seaboard was settled primarily by English colonists in the 17th century, along with much smaller numbers of Dutch and Swedes. Colonial America was characterized by a severe labor shortage that required reliance on involuntary forms of labor, such as slavery and indentured servitude, and by a policy of benevolent British indifference, which allowed the development of an American spirit distinct from that of the European mother country. 16. Over half of all European immigrants to colonial America were indentured servitude. 17. The first successful English colony was established in 1607 on the James River at Jamestown, the beginning of the American frontier. It declined for several decades until a new wave of settlers arrived in the late 17th century and established a commercial agriculture based on tobacco. Between the late 1610s and the American Revolution, the English brought some 50,000 prisoners to the American colonies. 18. A particularly bad example was the Powhatan Rebellion of 1622 in Virginia, in which Native Americans killed hundreds of English settlers. The largest conflict between Native Americans and English settlers in the 17th century was King Philip's War in New England, 19, and the Bloody Yamasee War in South Carolina, the massacre of settlers at Jamestown in 1622. Soon the colonists in the South feared all natives as enemies. The Puritans were the primary early settlers of New England, founding the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, although there was a small earlier settlement in 1620 by a similar group, the Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony. The Middle Colonies, which included the present-day states of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, were characterized by a great degree of religious diversity. The first English settlement to seek to establish south of Virginia was the province of Carolina, with the colony of Georgia, the last of the 13 colonies, established in 1733. 21. The colonies were characterized by religious diversity, with many Congregationalists in New England, German and Dutch, Reformed theology in the Middle Colonies, Catholics in Maryland, and Scots-Irish Presbyterians in the frontier regions. Many royal officials and merchants were Anglican. Religious belief grew rapidly after the First Great Awakening, a revival movement in the 1740s led by preachers such as Jonathan Edwards. Influenced by the Great Awakening, American evangelicals added a new emphasis on the spiritual outpouring of the Holy Spirit and conversions that instilled in new believers a strong love for God. Revivalists incorporated these features and passed them on to the newly formed evangelical sect, laying the groundwork for the Second Great Awakening that began in the late 1790s. 23. Each of the 13 American colonies had a slightly different government structure. Typically, a colony was ruled by a governor who was appointed by London and responsible for the executive branch and relied on a locally elected parliament to vote on taxes and make laws. In the 18th century, the American colonies grew rapidly because of their abundance of land and food and low death rates. The colonies were wealthier than most areas of Britain. This attracted a steady stream of immigrants, especially young men, who came to America as indentured servants. Tobacco and rice plantations imported black slaves from the British West Indies. By the 1770s, they made up 1/5 of the American population. The question of independence from Britain did not arise as long as the colonies needed British troops to defend against the French and Spanish powers. These threats disappeared by 1765. London viewed the existence of the American colonies solely for the benefit of the mother country, a policy known as mercantilism. 24. Autonomy and political integration, join or die. 1756 political cartoon by Benjamin Franklin urging the colonies to unite in the war against the French and the Native Americans. The French and Indian War, 1754-1763, was a turning point in the political development of the American colonies. The influence of the two main opponents of British authority in the American and Canadian colonies, the French and the Native Americans, was greatly reduced. Furthermore, the war effort resulted in greater political integration among the colonies, as reflected in the Albany Congress and expressed in Benjamin Franklin's call for the colonies to enter or perish. Franklin was a man of many innovations. His greatest was the concept of a United States of America, which emerged after 1765 and was implemented in July 1776. Saint-Tropez, 25. Following the British acquisition of French territory in North America, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, which aimed to organize the new North American Empire and protect the Native Americans from further settlement expansion into the western lands. In the following years, tensions grew between the colonists and the Crown. The British Parliament passed the Stamp Act of 1765, imposing a new tax on the colonies without the consent of the colonial parliaments. The question was raised: did the British Parliament have the right to tax the Americans without representation? Crying no taxation without representation, the settlers refused to pay the tax as tensions escalated in the late 1760s and early 1770s. The 1846 painting depicting the Boston Tea Party of 1773. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was a direct action by activists in the town of Boston to protest a new tax on tea. The British Parliament quickly responded the following year with the Intolerable Acts, stripping Massachusetts of its historic autonomy and placing it under military rule. This sparked anger and protest in all 13 colonies. Patriot leaders from the 13 colonies convened the First Continental Congress to coordinate resistance to the intolerable acts of the British Parliament. The Congress called for a boycott of trade, with Britain published a list of rights and grievances and petitioned the king for redress. 27. The petition to the king was unsuccessful, and so the Second Continental Congress was convened in 1775 to organize the colony's defense against the British Army. The common people became rebels against the British, although they were unfamiliar with the basic theories of the ideology being taught to them. They held a very strong sense of rights that they felt were being deliberately violated by the British, namely local autonomy, fair treatment, and popular government. They were sensitive to the tyranny they had seen when the British Army came to Boston to punish the Bostonians. This increased their sense that their human rights were being violated, leading to resentment and demands for revenge. They had a belief that God was on their side. 28. The American Revolutionary War began at Concord and Lexington in April 1775, when the British attempted to seize ammunition depots and arrest Patriot leaders. Population density in the American colonies in 1775. American Revolution main article, History of the United States, 1776, 1789. George Washington's surprise crossing of the Delaware River in December 1776 was a major reversal of fortune after the loss of New York City. His army defeated the British in 2 battles and recaptured New Jersey. The 13 colonies began rebelling against British rule in 1775 and declared independence in 1776 as the United States of America. During the American Revolutionary War, 1775-1783, the American capture of the British invasion force at Saratoga in 1777 strengthened the Northeast and encouraged the French to form a military alliance with the United States. France drew Spain and the Netherlands into the alliance, thus balancing the land and naval forces on each side, since Britain had no allies. 29. General George Washington, 1732-1799, proved to be an excellent commander and organizer. He worked successfully with the Continental Congress and the state governors, selected and instructed senior officers, supported and instructed his troops, and maintained an army that was oriented toward the ideals of a republic. His greatest challenge was logistics, as neither the Continental Congress nor the states had the funds to provide adequate equipment, ammunition, medical care, pay, or even food for his troops. As a field tactician, Washington was often outnumbered by his British counterparts. As a strategist, he had better ideas about how to win than they did. The British sent 4 invasion armies. Washington's strategy forced the First Army out of Boston in 1776 and forced the Second and Third Armies to surrender at Saratoga, 1777, and Yorktown, 1781. He limited British control to New York City and a few other places, while the Patriots controlled most of the population. 30. The Loyalists, whom the British relied on so heavily, made up about 20% of the population, but were never well organized. When the war ended, Washington watched with pride as the last British troops quietly sailed out of New York City in November 1783, taking the Loyalist leadership with them. Washington stunned the world when, rather than seize power for himself, he quietly retired to his farm in Virginia. 30 political scientist Seymour Martin Lipset observed that the United States was the first major colony to successfully resist colonial rule. In this sense, it was the first new nation. 31. John Trumbull's Declaration of Independence. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia declared the independence of the United States of America with the Declaration of Independence. July 4th is celebrated as a national holiday. The new nation was founded on the liberal Enlightenment ideals known to Thomas Jefferson as the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and was strongly devoted to Republicans' principles. Republicanism emphasized the sovereignty of the people rather than hereditary monarchs, demanded citizenship, shunned corruption, and rejected aristocracy. Betty II, national religion. The American Revolution was the main driving force of the non-denominational American national religion that has shaped patriotism, memory, and the meaning of the nation's birth ever since. Battles are not the focus, but rather events and people who have been celebrated as symbols of some faith. As historians have noted, the American Revolution produced a leader likened to Moses, George Washington, prophets, Thomas Jefferson, Tom Paine, and martyrs, Boston Massacre, Nathan Hale, as well as demons, Benedict Arnold, sacred places, Valley, Forge, Bunker Hill, or doctrines, the Boston Tea Party, symbols, the new flag, holy days, July 4th, and a Bible whose every verse was carefully studied and applied to current legal cases, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. 33. The first years of the Republic economic growth in the United States per capita. The index for 1700 was set at 100. The Articles of Confederation and the Constitution say also Articles of Confederation in the 1780s. The national government was able to settle the issue of the Western territories, which were ceded by the states to the United States Congress and became territories. As settlers moved into the Northwest, now the American Midwest, these territories soon became states. Nationalists feared that the new nation was too weak to withstand an international war or even internal rebellions such as Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786. Nationalists, mostly veterans, organized in every state and convinced Congress to convene the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. Delegates from each state wrote a new constitution that established a much more powerful and efficient central government. This government had a strong president and the power to levy taxes. The new government reflected prevailing Republican ideas, guaranteeing individual liberties and restraining government power through a system of separation of powers. 34. Congress was given the power to ban the international slave trade after 20 years, implemented in 1807. The South's electoral votes were increased by counting 3/5 of the number of slaves in each state's population. As slavery expanded in the South over the following decades, this increased the political power of Southern representatives in the United States Congress. To alleviate fears of an overly powerful federal government from anti-federalists, the nation passed the United States Bill of Rights in 1791. The act included the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, guaranteeing individual liberties such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, trial by jury, and stating that citizens and states had the right to reservations, but did not specify what these rights were. 35 new executive branch leadership. George Washington, a famous hero of the American Revolutionary War, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and President of the Constitutional Convention, became the first president of the United States under the new Constitution in 1789. The national capital moved from New York to Philadelphia and finally settled in Washington, D.C. in 1800. The great achievements of George Washington's administration were the creation of a strong national government that was accepted by the American people without question. 36. His administration, under the energetic leadership of Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, assumed the debts of the states. The lenders then received federal bonds, established the Bank of the United States to balance the financial system, and instituted a uniform system of tariffs, import duties, and other taxes to pay off the debt and provide a financial infrastructure. To support his programs, Hamilton founded a new political party, the world's first voter-based party, the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison formed an opposition Republican Party, often referred to by political scientists as the Democratic Republican Party. Hamilton and Washington presented the nation with the Jay Treaty of 1794, re-establishing friendly relations with Great Britain. The Jeffersonians strongly opposed it, and voters voted along party lines, thus creating the first party system. The Federalists promoted commerce, finance, and commercial interests, and wanted more trade with Great Britain. Republicans accused the Federalists of planning to establish a monarchy, turn the wealthy into a ruling class, and turn the United States into a pawn of Great Britain. 37. The treaty passed, but the political situation became increasingly heated. 38. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, when settlers in the West, now the Midwest, protested against a federal tax on alcoholic beverages, was the first serious challenge to the federal government. Washington called out state militia to suppress the rebellion and personally led the troops as the rebellion gradually died down and the authority of the national government was firmly established. 39. Washington refused to serve more than 2 terms, setting a precedent for later presidents. And in his famous farewell address, he praised the benefits of the federal government and the importance of morality, while warning against foreign alliances and the formation of political parties. 40. John Adams, a Federalist, defeated Jefferson in the presidential election of 1796. War with France was imminent, and the Federalists used this opportunity to silence the Republicans with anti-sedition and anti-alien laws, collectively known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, build a large army with Hamilton at its head, and prepare to counter a French invasion. However, the Federalists became divided after Adams sent a successful peace mission to France to end the war in 1798. 37. Kaplan's fourth one, slavery. During the first 2 decades after the American Revolution, there were dramatic changes in the status of slavery among the states and an increase in the number of free blacks. Inspired by revolutionary ideas of human equality and less economic dependence on slavery, the northern states abolished slavery, although some states had gradual stages of emancipation. The Upper South states made it easier to emancipate slaves, resulting in an increase in the percentage of free blacks in the Upper South from less than 1% in 1792 to over 10% in 1810. At that time, a total of 13.5% of the total black population in the United States was free. 42. After that time, as the demand for slaves increased and cotton cultivation expanded in the Deep South, the rate of emancipation slowed rapidly. The domestic slave trade became an important source of wealth for many planters and merchants. 18th. Century Democratic Republican era Thomas Jefferson considered himself a frontiersman and a scientist. He was deeply interested in the expansion and exploration of the West. Territorial expansion with the Louisiana Purchase is shown in white. Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in the presidential election of 1800. Jefferson's major achievement as president was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which provided American settlers with a vast potential area for expansion west of the Mississippi River. 43. Jefferson himself was a scientist, and he supported expeditions to explore and map new territory, most notably the Lewis and Clark expedition. 44. Jefferson believed deeply in republicanism and believed that it should be based on independent yeoman farmers and planters. He was suspicious of towns, factories, and banks. He also distrusted the federal government and judges and sought to weaken the judiciary. However, he found a worthy opponent in John Marshall, a Federalist from Virginia. Although the United States Constitution included a Supreme Court, its functions were vague until Marshall served as Chief Justice. He defined these functions, especially the power to overturn any act of Congress deemed to violate the Constitution. This power was claimed in 1803 in Marbury v. Madison. 45. War of 1812 main article. War of 1812, Americans were increasingly angry with Britain for violating the neutrality of American ships to the detriment of France. Britain had captured 10,000 American sailors to serve in the Royal Navy against Napoleon, and the British also supported Native American hostilities against American settlers in the Midwest. The Americans also may have sought to annex all or part of British North America. 46, 47, 48, 49, 50. Despite opposition from the northeastern states, especially the Federalists, who did not want to cut off trade with Britain, the United States Congress declared war on Britain in June 1812. 51. The war was a disappointment for both sides. Both sides attempted to invade the other, but were driven back. The American High Command remained ineffective until the final year. The American militia proved ineffective, as soldiers were reluctant to leave home, and repeated attempts to invade Canada failed. The British blockade damaged American commerce, bankrupted the treasury, and further angered New Englanders smuggling supplies to Britain. The Americans under General William Henry Harrison finally gained control of the waterways on Lake Erie and defeated the Native Americans under Tecumseh in Canada. 52. While Andrew Jackson ended the Native American threat in the Southeast, the threat of Native American encroachment into the Midwest was ended forever. The British invaded and occupied most of Maine. The British raided and burned Washington, D.C., but were repulsed in Baltimore in 1814, where the Star-Spangled Banner was written to celebrate the American success. In upstate New York, a major British invasion of the state was repulsed. Finally, in early 1815, Andrew Jackson decisively defeated a major British invasion at the Battle of New Orleans, and he became one of the most celebrated war heroes. 53. With Napoleon apparently hopeless, the cause of war had dissipated, and both sides agreed to peace, resulting in the pre-war borders remaining unchanged. The Americans declared victory in early 1815 when news arrived almost immediately of Jackson's victory at New Orleans and the peace treaty. Americans were proud of their success in the Second War of Independence. The Federalists and anti-war protesters were humiliated and never had a chance to recover. The Native Americans were the biggest losers because they never achieved the independent national sovereignty that the British had promised them. They also ceased to pose a formidable threat as settlers poured into the Midwest. 53. The age of good feelings, strong opponents of the War of 1812. The Federalists opened the Hartford Convention in 1814 with the implied intention of seceding from the Union. The national euphoria following the victory at New Orleans had shattered the Federalist prestige, and they no longer played a prominent role. 54. President Madison and most Republicans realized that they had been foolish in allowing the Bank of the United States to close because its absence greatly hindered the financing of the war. So they chartered the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. 155. 56. Republicans also imposed tariffs to protect infant industries, which had been created when Britain blockaded the United States. With the collapse of the Federalist Party, the adoption of many Federalist principles by the Republicans, and President James Monroe's systematic policy of reducing partisanship during his 2 terms, 1817 to 25, the United States entered an era of good feelings with far less partisanship than before or since, and ended the first-party system. 56, the Monroe Doctrine, stated in 1823, stated the view of the United States that European powers should not colonize or interfere in the Americas. It was a decisive factor in United States foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine was adopted in response to British and American fears of French and Russian expansion into the Western Hemisphere. 57 Native American migration settlers crossed the Nebraska plains. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the president to negotiate treaties to exchange land west of the Mississippi River for Native American tribal lands in the eastern states. 58, Jacksonian Democrats demanded the forced removal of Native Americans who refused to accept state laws to their reservations in the West. Religious leaders and the Whigs opposed this action as inhumane, as they had seen in the Trail of Tears. 59. Many Seminoles in Florida refused to move west. They had fought against the military for years in the Seminole Wars. The Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a Protestant revival movement that affected the entire United States in the early 19th century and led to rapid church growth. The movement began around 1790, gained momentum in 1800, and after 1820 saw a surge in membership among Baptist and Methodist congregations, as these congregations had many missionary leaders in the movement. The movement reached its peak in the 1840s, 60. The movement added millions of new members to existing evangelical denominations and led to the formation of new denominations. Many converts believed that the Great Awakening heralded a new millennium. The Second Great Awakening sparked the formation of several reform movements, including abolitionism and temperance movements to eradicate social ills in anticipation of Jesus' predicted second coming. 61. Abolitionism after 1840. The growing abolitionist movement redefined itself as a crusade against the sins of slaveholders. The movement mobilized support, especially among devout women in the Northeast, influenced by the Second Great Awakening. William Lloyd Garrison published the most influential of the many anti-slavery newspapers, The Liberator, while Frederick Douglass, a former slave, began writing for the paper around 1840 and started his own anti-slavery newspaper, The North. Star was in 1847, Juribes. Most abolitionists, such as Abraham Lincoln, rejected Garrison's theology and held that slavery was an unfortunate social evil rather than a sin. 63. 64. Western expansion and manifest destiny. The American colonies and new nations grew rapidly in population and area as pioneers flocked to the western settlement frontier. 65. This process finally ended between 1890 and 1910, when the last major farm and ranch lands were settled. Native American tribes in some places resisted with force, but they were overwhelmed by settlers and the military, and after 1830 were removed to reservations in the West. The influential frontier theory argued that the frontier created the nation's character with its boldness, violence, initiative, individualism, and democracy. Historians have emphasized the multicultural nature of the American frontier. Extensive and widespread media attention has focused on the Wild West of the latter half of the 19th century. As Hine and Farragher define it, frontier history tells the story of the creation and defense of communities, the use of land, the development of markets, and the founding of states. They explain that it is a story of conquest, but it is also a story of survival, persistence, and the integration of the peoples and cultures that emerged and continued to live in America. Through wars and treaties establishing law and order, building farms and towns, digging trails and mining, and attracting countless foreign immigrants. The United States expanded from coast to coast to fulfill the dream of manifest destiny. As the American frontier became history, the myths of the West in novels and films took a firm hold on the imagination of Americans and foreigners alike. America, in particular, chose an iconic image for itself. No other nation, as David Murdoch has said, has taken a time and place from its past to create a structure for the imagination that has matched the creation of the American West. From the early 1830s to 1869, the Oregon Trail and its many sub-trails were used by over 300,000 settlers. Farmers, ranchers, and private business owners and their families headed for California, Oregon, and other points in the far west. The wagons traveled overland for 5 to 6 months. After 1869, the trip took only 6 days by rail. The United States captured Mexico City during the Mexican-American War. Manifest destiny was the belief that American settlers were destined to expand across the North American continent. The concept was born of a sense of duty to redeem the old world by a culmination model, created by the potentialities of a new land for the building of a new paradise. 69. The phrase itself had different meanings for different groups of people, but was rejected by modernizers. Modernizers wanted to build cities and factories, not more farms. Daniel Walker Howe argues that American imperialism did not represent the consensus of the American people. It created bitter dissension within the national community. 70. In fact, the Democratic Party supported territorial expansion, while the majority of Whigs opposed it. Nevertheless, manifest destiny provided the rhetoric for the purchase or acquisition of the largest territory the United States had. After bitter debate in Congress, the Republic of Texas was annexed by the United States in 1845, despite warnings from Mexico that it would mean war. War broke out in 1846, with the home front divided between the Whigs opposed to the Democrats, who supported the war. The United States Army, using regulars and a large volunteer force, easily won the Mexican-American War, 1846-48. Public sentiment in the United States was divided as the Whigs and anti-slavery elements opposed the war. The Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo ceded California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and surrounding areas to the United States, while granting full U.S. citizenship to the people living in these areas. Soon after gold was discovered in Northern California, over 100,000 people flocked there within a few months. This event is known as the California Gold Rush, division between North and South Northern Confederacy. Blue, freedom; yellow, slavery; Confederate, brown territories are shaded in light. The central issue after 1848 was the expansion of slavery. This pitted the anti-slavery majority in the North against the pro-slavery majority in the South. A small but active group of Northerners were abolitionists, declaring that owning slaves was a sin in Protestant theology and demanding the immediate abolition of slavery. The much larger group opposed the expansion of slavery and sought to time its disappearance so that America could become a land of freedom, free labor, without slaves, and free speech, as opposed to the strict censorship of the South. Southern whites insisted that slavery was a cultural and socio-economic benefit to all whites, and even to the slaves themselves, and denounced all anti-slavery speakers as abolitionists. Religious activists were also divided over slavery, with Methodists and Baptists dividing into Northern and Southern denominations. In the North, Methodists, Congregationalists, and Quakers had large abolitionist followings, especially among women activists. Catholics, Episcopalians, and Lutherans largely ignored the issue of slavery. The issue of slavery in the new territories was largely settled by the Compromise of 1850, negotiated by Whig Henry Clay and Democrat Stephen A. Douglas. The compromise included the admission of California as a free, non-slave state. The sticking point was the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it easier for slave owners to reclaim their runaway slaves. Abolitionists seized on this act to attack slavery, as in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Compromise of 1820 was repealed in 1854 by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, sponsored by Senator Douglas in the name of popular sovereignty and democracy. The act allowed settlers to decide on slavery in each territory and allowed Douglas to say that he was neutral on the issue of slavery. Anti-slavery forces were increasingly angry and alarmed. They formed a new Republican Party, pro- and anti-slavery. Forces flocked to Kansas to vote on whether to abolish or retain slavery, provoking a minor civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. By the late 1850s, the young Republican Party dominated all the northern states and thus the Electoral College, and insisted that slavery would never be allowed to expand and thus would eventually disappear. Southern slave societies grew rich from their cotton and other consumer goods. Some profited from the domestic slave trade. They were linked to northern cities such as Boston and New York City through banking, shipping, and manufacturing. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the South, nearly 8 times the total number of slaves in the country in 1790. Plantations were highly profitable thanks to the strong European demand for raw cotton. Much of the profit was invested in new land and newly purchased slaves from the declining tobacco-growing regions. For 50 of the first 72 years of the United States, the presidency was held by a slave owner. During this period, only presidents who owned slaves were re-elected to a second term, 76. In addition, Southern states benefited by their increased apportionment in Congress due to the partial counting of slaves in their populations. A number of attempted and actual slave rebellions failed, including those of Gabriel Prosser, 1800, Denmark Vesey, 1822, Nat Turner, 1831, and John Brown, 1859. These rebellions led to Southern states establishing stricter controls on slavery and reducing the rights of free blacks. The Supreme Court's 1857 decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford, which accepted the Southern position that slavery was legal anywhere in the country, angered Northerners Abraham Lincoln with Allan Pinkerton and Major General John Alexander McClernand at the Battle of Antietam. After Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860, 7 Southern states seceded from the Union between late 1860 and 1861, forming a new government, the Confederate States of America, on February 8, 1861. When Lincoln ordered troops to suppress the Confederacy in April 1861, 4 more states seceded and joined the Confederacy, along with the northwestern portion of Virginia that later became West Virginia. 4 of the 5 northernmost legalized slavery states did not secede and became border states. Civil War main article, American Civil War. The American Civil War began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces attacked the United States military base at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. In response to the attack, on April 15, Lincoln ordered the states to send forces totaling $75,000 to retake the forts, defend the capital, and preserve the Union, which in his view remained intact despite the actions of the seceding states. The 2 armies had their first major clashes at the first Battle of Bull Run, which ended in a surprise Union defeat. Importantly, however, the battle demonstrated to both the Union and the Confederacy that the war would be longer and bloodier than originally anticipated, 78. The war was soon divided into 2 theaters, the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater. In the Western Theater, the Union was quite successful with major battles such as Perryville and Shiloh, which resulted in strategic Union victories and crushed major Confederate campaigns. 79. The war in the East began badly for the Union, with a Confederate victory at Manassas Junction, Bull Run, just outside Washington. Major General George B. McClellan was given command of all Union Army units. After reorganizing the new Army of the Potomac, McClellan failed to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia during the Peninsula Campaign and withdrew after being attacked by newly appointed Confederate General Robert E. Lee. 80. Feeling confident in his army after defeating the Union at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Lee embarked on an invasion of the North but was stopped by General McClellan at the bloody Battle of Antietam. However, McClellan was relieved of his command for refusing to pursue Lee's remnants. His successor, General Ambrose Burnside, was defeated by Lee's outnumbered army at the Battle of Fredericksburg in late 1862, forcing another change of command. Lee won again at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863. First, Lee invaded Pennsylvania to resupply and inflict attrition on the North. Perhaps the turning point of the war came when Lee's army was decisively defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 3rd, 1863. 81. Battle of Franklin, November 30th, 1864. Meanwhile, on July 4th, 1863, Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant gained control of the Mississippi River at the Battle of Vicksburg, thus tearing the Confederacy in two. Lincoln made General Grant commander of all Union Army units. The final 2 years of the war were bloody for both sides, with Grant waging a war of attrition against Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. This war of attrition was divided into three major campaigns. The first was the Overland Campaign, which forced Lee to retreat to the city of Petersburg, where Grant launched his second major offensive in the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign, which besieged Petersburg. After a siege of nearly 10 months, Petersburg surrendered. However, the defenders of Fort Gregg allowed Lee to withdraw his army from Petersburg. Grant followed suit and launched his final campaign, the Appomattox Campaign, which resulted in Lee ordering the Army of Northern Virginia to surrender on April 9, 1865, at the Appomattox County Courthouse. Other Confederate armies followed suit, and the war ended without a post-war insurgency. According to 1860 United States Census data, approximately 8% of all white males aged 13 to 43 died in the war, including 6% in the North and 18% in the South. 82. Making the Civil War the deadliest war in American history. Its legacy includes the end of slavery in the United States, the restoration of the Union, and the strengthening of the role of the central government, Reconstruction, and the Gilded. Age-free blacks vote in New Orleans, 1867. The Reconstruction era lasted from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, until the Compromise of 1877. 83. The major issues facing Lincoln were the status of former slaves, known as freedmen, the loyalty and civil rights of former rebel soldiers, the status of the 11 former Confederate states, the power of the federal government needed to prevent a future civil war, and the question of whether Congress or the President would make major decisions. The dire threats of starvation and homelessness among unemployed former slaves were addressed through the first major federal relief agency, the Freedmen's Bureau, operated by the United States Army. 84. 3 Reconstruction Amendments were passed to extend civil rights to Black Americans. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equality for all and citizenship for blacks. The 15th Amendment prohibited the use of race as a reason to deprive a person of citizenship. Although the former rebels still held most of the southern states for more than 2 years, that changed when radical Republicans won effective control of the United States Congress in the elections of 1866. President Andrew Johnson, who sought to ease the process of reunification with the former rebels, was left with little power. He himself escaped impeachment by a single vote. Congress granted blacks the right to vote and stripped many former Confederates of their right to public office. Republican governments came to power in alliance with freedmen, former slaves, carpetbaggers, newcomers to the South from the North, and scalawags, native Southern whites who supported Reconstruction. They were backed by the United States. Army de Paz, opponents said these groups were corrupt and violated white rights. The new Republican League lost power state by state to the conservative Democratic League, which eventually gained control of the entire South by 1877. In response to the radical Reconstruction process, the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, was formed in 1867. It was a white supremacist organization that opposed Republican rule and civil rights for blacks. President Ulysses Grant vigorously enforced the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1870 to suppress the group. As a result, the group was disbanded. However, other paramilitary groups, such as the White League and the Red Shirts, attempted to regain political power for whites in states across the South during the 1870s. 85. Reconstruction ended after the disputed election of 1876 between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. After a compromise, Hayes won the presidency. The federal government withdrew troops from the South, and the Southern Democratic Party re-entered the national political arena. 86. After 1890, Southern states completely disenfranchised black voters. Blacks were segregated in public places and remained second-class citizens in a system known as Jim Crow, until the Civil Rights Movement gained ground in 1964-65. 87. 88. Completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, 1869 photograph by Andrew J. Russell. The latter half of the 19th century was marked by the growth and settlement of the American West, first by horse-drawn wagons and then aided by the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and frequent warfare with Native Americans as settlers encroached on traditional Native American lands. Gradually, the United States purchased their lands and erased their claims, forcing most tribes onto limited reservations, according to the United States Census Bureau, 1894. The wars between the Native Americans and the United States government totaled more than 40. They caused the deaths of about 19,000 people, including white women and children, and about 30,000 Native people. 89. The Galvanization Era is a term used by Mark Twain to describe a period in the late 19th century when American wealth and prosperity increased dramatically. Reforms of the era included the Civil Service Act, which required applicants for government jobs to compete against each other based on merit. Other important laws included the Interstate Commerce Act, which ended railroad discrimination against small shipping companies, and the Sherman Antitrust Act, which prohibited monopolies in business. Mark Twain believed that the era was corrupted by elements such as land speculators, corrupt politics, and unscrupulous business practices. Shelley 90. By 1890, American industrial output and per capita income exceeded those of all other nations in the world. In response to mounting debt and falling agricultural prices, cotton and wheat farmers joined the People's Party. 91. The sudden influx of European immigrants helped both supply labor for American industry and create multiracial communities in previously undeveloped areas. Between 1880 and 1914, the peak years of immigration, over 22 million people immigrated to the United States. 92. Workers' demands for control over their workplaces led to frequent riots in cities and mining camps. Industrial leaders included John D. Rockefeller in oil and Andrew Carnegie in steel. Both became philanthropic leaders, giving their fortunes to build a modern system of hospitals, universities, libraries, and foundations. Mulberry Street with Manhattan's Little Italy in the middle. The Lower East Side circa 1900, almost 97% of the residents of the 10 largest American cities in 1900 were non-Hispanic white. 93. A severe national economic crisis broke out in 1893. This crisis, known as the Panic of 1893, affected farmers, workers, and merchants, with prices, wages, and profits falling. 94. Many railroads went bankrupt. The political response to the crisis fell to the Democratic Party, and the Democratic president, Grover Cleveland, shouldered much of the blame. Labor unrest included numerous strikes. The most prominent was the violent Pullman strike of 1894, which was put down by federal troops under orders from President Cleveland. The People's Party gained strength among cotton and wheat farmers and coal miners, but was later overtaken by the more popular Free Silver movement. The Free Silver movement called for the use of silver to increase the money supply, leading to inflation that its proponents believed was, the movement believes that the crisis will end. 95. The financial, railroad, and business communities strongly opposed the idea that only the gold standard could save the economy. In the most bitterly contested election in the nation's history, conservative Republican William McKinley defeated free silver advocate William Jennings Bryan. Bryan won the South and the West, but McKinley won big among the middle class, workers, cities, and large farmers in the Midwest. 96. Prosperity returned under President McKinley. The gold standard was adopted, and tariffs were raised. By 1900, the United States had the strongest economy on Earth. Aside from two brief economic crises, in 1907 and 1920, the overall economy remained prosperous and grew until 1929. The Republican Party took credit for McKinley's policies. 97. 20th century, progressive times, middle-class dissatisfaction with political corruption and inefficiency, along with the failure to deal with increasingly important industrial and urban problems, led to the formation of a dynamic progressive movement beginning in the 1890s. In every city, state, and national level, in education, health, and industry, progressives called for the modernization and reform of weak agencies, the elimination of corruption in politics, and the introduction of efficiency as a prerequisite for change. Leading politicians of both parties, most notably Theodore Roosevelt, Charles Evans Hughes, and Robert La Follette on the Republican side, and William Jennings Bryan on the Democratic side, embraced the path of progressive reform. Women in particular became active in demanding suffrage, prohibition, and better education. The most prominent women's leader was Jane Addams of Chicago. Progressives enacted antitrust laws and established regulations for industries such as public meatpacking, pharmaceuticals, and railroads. 4 new constitutional amendments, the 16th through 19th Amendments, resulted from the activities of the progressive movement, which led to the creation of a federal income tax, direct election of senators, prohibition of alcohol, and women's suffrage. 98. The progressive movement lasted through the 1920s. The most active period was 1900-1918. 99. Imperialism. See also American imperialism. The United States became a world military and economic power after 1890. The main episode was the Spanish-American War, which began when Spain refused American demands to modify its repressive policies in Cuba. Up till the Splendid Little War, as one official called it, consisted of a series of quick American victories on land and at sea. At the Treaty of Paris Peace Conference, the United States took the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. 101. Cuba became an independent nation under close American tutelage. Although the war was popular, the terms of the peace treaty were controversial. William Jennings Bryan led the Democratic Party in opposition to U.S. control of the Philippines. He condemned the control of the Philippines as an act of imperialism, incompatible with American democracy. For some. 101. President William McKinley defended the American action. He was well served by a return to American prosperity and a sense of victory in the war. McKinley easily defeated Bryan in a rematch in the 1900 presidential election. 102. After defeating a nationalist uprising in the Philippines, the United States embarked on a program of massive modernization of the Philippine economy and significant improvements in public health facilities. 103. By 1908, however, Americans had lost interest in an imperial America and turned their international attention to the Caribbean, particularly the construction of the Panama Canal. In 1912, when Arizona became the last state in the mainland United States, the American frontier ended. The canal opened in 1914 and increased trade with Japan and the rest of the Far East. A major reform initiative was the open door policy, under which imperialist powers were allowed to trade fairly with China, but no one was allowed to occupy China. 104. World War Why American Cemetery at Romain-sur-Montfaucon. World War I raged in Europe from 1914. President Woodrow Wilson took complete control of foreign policy. He declared neutrality, but warned Germany that continued unrestricted submarine warfare against American shipping supplying the Allies would mean war. Germany decided to take the risk and seek victory by cutting off supplies to Britain. The United States declared war in April 1917. 105. American money, food, and ammunition arrived quickly, but soldiers had to be recruited and trained. By the summer of 1918, American troops under General John J. Pershing were arriving at a rate of 10,000 a day, while Germany could not replace the dead. 106. The result was an Allied victory in November 1918. President Wilson demanded that Germany depose the Kaiser and accept his terms, known as the 14 Points. Wilson dominated the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, but Germany was severely dealt with by the Allies in the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, as Wilson placed all his hopes on the newly formed League of Nations. Wilson refused to compromise with Republican senators on the issue of the United States Congress's power to declare war. As a result, the United States Senate rejected the treaty and the League of Nations. 107. Women's suffrage. Alice Paul wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, but it was not passed and became an unachieved goal of the feminist movement of the 1970s. The women's suffrage movement began with the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. At this convention, the Declaration of Sentiments was produced and called for equal rights for women. Many activists became politically active during the abolitionist movement. The first wave women's suffrage campaign was led by Mott, Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, among others. The movement reorganized after the Civil War, adding experienced activists. Many of these worked hard to promote prohibition of alcohol. By the end of the 19th century, only a few Western states granted women full suffrage, 1 or 8, although women achieved significant legal victories in areas such as real estate and child custody. 109. Around 1912, the women's rights movement, which had previously been inactive, began to reawaken, emphasizing their demands for equal rights and arguing that the American political bureaucracy needed to be cleansed by women, because men could not do it. 110. Protests began to grow in popularity as suffragist Alice Paul led marches through the capital and major cities. Paul split from the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NAWSA, which favored a more moderate pro-democratic party, and President Woodrow Wilson, led by Carrie Chapman Catt. Paul founded the more militant National Woman Suffrage Association. Suffragists were arrested during silent picket demonstrations at the White House. This was the first time such a tactic had been used, and those arrested became political prisoners. Juan de Virven. The argument of opponents of women's suffrage that only men could fight in a war and therefore only men should have the right to vote was rejected by tens of thousands of American women on the home front during World War I. Throughout the world, permissive states allowed women to vote. Furthermore, most Western states granted women the right to vote in national and state elections. Representatives from these states, including the first woman, Jeanette Rankin of Montana, demonstrated that women's suffrage was a success. Opposition was mainly from the South, where white leaders feared the threat posed by black women voters. Congress passed the 19th Amendment in 1919, and women could vote in 1920. 112, NAWSA became the League of Women Voters, and the National Women's League began lobbying for equal rights and the Equal Rights Amendment. The amendment passed Congress during the second wave of the women's movement in 1972. However, it expired without being ratified by all the states. Politicians responded to the demands of the new Electoral College by focusing on issues of particular concern to women, especially prohibition, child health, and world peace. 113. 114. The climax of women's suffrage occurred in 1928 when political machines in major cities realized they needed women's support to elect Al Smith, a Catholic from New York City. Meanwhile, Protestants rallied women to support prohibition and elected Republican Herbert Hoover. 115. The Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. See also Great Depression and New Deal prohibition agents burned barrels of liquor in Chicago. 1921. During the 1920s, the United States steadily grew in stature as a world military and economic power. The United States Senate ratified the Treaty of Versailles, which the Allies had imposed on the defeated Central Powers. Instead, the United States chose to pursue a unilateral policy. 116. The aftermath of the October Revolution brought real fears of communism in the United States, leading to the Red Menace phenomenon and the expulsion of foreigners suspected of subversive intentions. Although public health facilities developed rapidly during the Progressive Era and hospitals and medical schools were modernized, 117, the United States lost an estimated 675,000 lives in 1918 to the Spanish flu. 118, in 1920, the manufacture, sale, importation, and exportation of alcohol were banned by the 18th Amendment and Prohibition. As a result, bootlegging became a major business in the cities, largely controlled by bootleggers. The second wave of the KKK grew rapidly between 1922 and 1925, then collapsed. Immigration laws were passed to limit the number of newcomers. The 1920s were called the Roaring Twenties because of the great economic prosperity of the period. Jazz music became popular among the younger generation, and the decade is also known as the Jazz Age. Newspaper photographer Dorothea Lange's migrant mother depicts the plight of pea pickers in California, focusing on Florence Owens Thompson, a 32-year-old mother of 7 in Nipomo, California, in March 1936. The Great Depression, 1929-39, and the New Deal, 1933-36, were defining moments in American social, economic, and political history that reshaped the United States. 119. During the 1920s, the United States enjoyed widespread prosperity despite agricultural weakness. A financial bubble was inflated by an inflated stock market that later led to the stock market crash of October 29, 1929. 120. This event, along with many other economic factors, sparked a global economic crisis known as the Great Depression. During this period, the United States experienced deflation as prices fell. Unemployment rose from 3% in 1929 to 25% in 1933. Agricultural prices fell by half, and manufacturing output fell by a third. In 1932, Democratic presidential candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt promised a New Deal for the American people. This was the enduring label for his domestic policies. The desperate economic situation and the Democratic Party's significant victories in the 1932 elections gave Roosevelt extraordinary influence over the United States Congress during the first 100 days of his presidency. He used his influence to quickly pass a series of policies that created welfare programs and imposed regulations on banking, the stock market, industry, and agriculture, among other government efforts to end the Great Depression and reform the American economy. The New Deal imposed many regulations on the economy, especially the financial sector. It provided relief to the unemployed, through numerous programs such as the Public Works Progress Administration, WPA, and the Civilian Conservation Corps. Large-scale spending projects designed to provide high-paying jobs and build infrastructure fell under the purview of the Public Works Progress Administration. Roosevelt turned left in 1935-36, forming unions with the Wagner Act. The unions became a powerful element of the emerging New Deal coalition. This coalition helped Roosevelt win re-election in 1936, 1940, and 1944 by mobilizing union members, working-class workers, welfare recipients, urban political machines, racial and religious groups, especially Catholics and Jews, and Southern whites, along with Northern blacks, where blacks had the right to vote. Some programs were eliminated in the 1940s as conservatives gained power in Congress with the Conservative Alliance. Of particular importance was the Social Security Program, which began in 1935. 121. World War II, Japan paralyzed the U.S. Navy with the attack on Pearl Harbor, destroying all the battleships. See also World War II and military history of the seas. United States during World War II. During the Great Depression, the United States remained focused on domestic concerns while democracy declined around the world. Many countries fell to dictators. Imperial Japan asserted its dominance in East Asia and the Pacific. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy militarized and threatened invasion, while Britain and France tried to appease the Allies to avoid a war in Europe. American law and the Neutrality Acts sought to avoid foreign conflicts. However, this policy conflicted with anti-Nazi sentiment after Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, starting World War II. Roosevelt positioned the United States as the arsenal of democracy, pledging to provide the Allies with full financial and munition support, but no troops. Austria, 122. Japan sought to neutralize American forces in the Pacific by attacking Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. This event brought the United States into the war and sought retaliation. 123. The major contributions of the United States to the Allied war effort included money, industrial output, food, oil, technological innovations, and, especially from 1944-1945, soldiers. Much of Washington's focus was on maximizing the nation's economic output. The overall result was a dramatic increase in gross national product, huge exports of supplies to the Allies and to American forces abroad, the end of unemployment, and increased domestic consumption, despite the fact that 40% of the nation's gross national product was spent on the war effort. This was achieved through the movement of tens of millions of workers from low-productivity occupations to high-efficiency jobs, through improvements in production under better management and technology, through the entry into the labor force of students, retirees, housewives, and the unemployed, and through increased hours of work. Everyone was on the move. Leisure activities were drastically reduced. People were willing to work overtime for patriotism, for the money, and for the confidence that this was just a temporary situation and that life would return to normal once the war was won. Most durable goods became scarce. Meat, clothing, and gasoline were severely rationed. Housing was in short supply in industrial areas as the population doubled and people lived in cramped quarters. Prices and wages were controlled. Americans saved much of their income, so the economy continued to grow after the war instead of falling back into depression. 124. 125. American soldiers lie on the beach at Tarawa, November 1943. The Allies, consisting of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, as well as China, Canada, and other nations, fought the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Allies viewed Germany as the primary threat and focused their highest priority on the European theater. The United States assumed almost all of the war against Japan and stopped Japanese expansion in the Pacific in 1942. After losing Pearl Harbor and the Philippines to Japan and being drawn into the Battle of the Coral Sea, May 1942, the United States Navy inflicted decisive damage on Japan at Midway, June 1942. American ground forces supported the North African Campaign, which eventually ended with the fall of the Italian fascist government in 1943, when Italy converted to the Allies. A more prominent front in Europe was opened on D-Day, Bars, June 6, 1944. On this front, American and Allied forces from Britain invaded German-occupied France. Photo: Into the Jaws of Death. The Normandy landings were the opening stage of the Allied invasion of Germany from the west. On the home front, the total mobilization of the American economy was directed by President Roosevelt's War Production Board. The wartime production boom led to a complete recovery from unemployment, erasing all traces of the Great Depression. In fact, the labor shortage encouraged industry to seek new sources of workers and thus created new roles for women and blacks. 166. However, the furor also sparked anti-Japanese sentiment that saw all people of Japanese descent forced to leave their homes in the war zone on the west coast of the United States. 127. Research and development also increased, most notably the Manhattan Project, a secret effort to use nuclear fission to create a highly destructive atomic bomb. 128. The Allies pushed the Germans out of France but faced a surprise counterattack at the Battle of the Bulge in December. The German effort failed as Allied ground forces on the eastern and western fronts simultaneously advanced on Berlin. The Nazis hastily attempted to kill the remaining Jews. The Western Front came to an abrupt halt, leaving Berlin in Soviet hands as the Nazi regime officially collapsed in May 1945, ending the war in Europe. 129. In the Pacific, the United States deployed island-hopping tactics, seizing each island gradually towards Tokyo, establishing airstrips for aerial attacks against the Japanese mainland from the Mariana Islands and winning hard-fought victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945. 130. After the bloody Battle of Okinawa, the United States prepared to invade the Japanese home islands while B-29s dropped 2 atomic bombs on 2 Japanese cities, forcing the Japanese Empire to surrender unconditionally and ending World War II. 131. The United States occupied Japan and part of Germany, dispatching Douglas MacArthur to rebuild the Japanese political system and economy along American lines. 132. Although the United States lost 400,000 soldiers, 133, the United States mainland prospered because it was not ravaged by war, as had happened in Europe and Asia. The United States' involvement in post-war foreign affairs marked the end of American isolationism. The terrifying threat of nuclear weapons fueled both optimism and fear. Nuclear weapons had not been used since 1945, when both sides of the Cold War stopped short of war. A period of long peace characterized the Cold War years from 1947-1991. However, there were regional wars in Korea and Vietnam. 134. The Cold War, Counterculture, and Civil Rights. President Kennedy's Civil Rights Speech, June 11, 1963. After World War II, the United States emerged as one of 2 superpowers, with the other being the Soviet Union, a bipartisan vote in ours. The United States Senate allowed the United States to join the United Nations. This marked a turn away from traditional American isolationism and toward greater involvement in international affairs. The primary goals of the United States from 1945-48 were to rescue Europe from the devastation of World War II and to contain the spread of communism represented by the Soviet Union. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 provided economic and military aid to Greece and Turkey in response to the threat of communist expansion in the Balkans. In 1948, the United States replaced its piecemeal financial aid programs with the comprehensive Marshall Plan, which pumped money into the Western European economies and dismantled trade barriers while modernizing business and government practices. The plan's budget was $13 billion, while the United States' gross domestic product was $258 billion in 1948. There was also $12 billion in U.S. aid to Europe between the end of the war and the start of the Marshall Plan. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin prevented his satellite states from participating in the plan. From that point on, with inefficient centralized economies, Eastern Europe fell further and further behind Western Europe in terms of economic prosperity and development. In 1949, the United States abandoned its long-standing policy of non-military alliances in peacetime by forming the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. In response, the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact of Communist States. In August 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapon, escalating the threat of war. In fact, the threat of mutual annihilation prevented the two powers from engaging in direct confrontation. The result was proxy wars, notably the Korean War and the Vietnam War, in which the two powers did not directly confront each other. Ace 134. Within the United States, the Cold War raised concerns about communist influence. The Soviet Union unexpectedly surpassed the United States technologically with Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, in 1957. This began the space race in which the United States eventually won when Apollo 11 landed astronauts on the moon in 1969. Concerns about the weakness of American education led to widespread federal support for American education in education and science. In the 1960 presidential election, charismatic politician John F. Kennedy was elected president, becoming the first and only Catholic president of the United States. His tenure in office was marked by such notable events as the acceleration of the United States' role in the space race, the escalation of the United States' role in the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the imprisonment of Martin Luther King, Jr. during the Birmingham anti-desegregation movement, and the appointment of his brother Robert F. Kennedy to the cabinet as United States Attorney General. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963, sending shockwaves through the nation. 138. The height of liberalism. The height of liberalism occurred in the mid-1960s with the success of President Lyndon B. Johnson, 1963-69, in gaining congressional support to pass his massive social programs. 139. These included civil rights, the end of racial segregation, Medicare, expanded welfare, federal support for education at all levels, aid to the development of arts and humanities programs, environmental activism, and a variety of poverty reduction programs. 140. 141. As modern historians have explained, gradually, liberal intellectuals articulated a new vision that aimed to achieve social and economic justice. Liberalism in the early 1960s was not radical, had little inclination to revive the New Deal crusades against concentrated economic power, and was not intended to stir up strong class sentiments or redistribute wealth or reorganize existing governmental structures. Internationally, it was strongly anti-communist. It aimed to preserve the free world, encourage domestic economic development, and ensure that the resulting wealth would be distributed fairly. Its agenda was heavily influenced by Keynesian economics, the idea that massive public spending would increase economic growth, thus creating public funds to finance larger welfare, housing, health, and education programs. 142. Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Jr. in Washington, D.C. on June 22, 1963, Johnson was rewarded with a landslide re-election victory in 1964 over conservative opponent Barry Goldwater, breaking decades of conservative control of Congress. However, the Republicans regained the upper hand in 1966 and elected Richard Nixon president in 1968. Nixon largely continued the New Deal and Great Society programs he had inherited. Conservatism prevailed again with the election of Ronald Reagan as president in 1980, 143. Meanwhile, the American people completed a great migration from farms to cities and experienced a period of sustained economic growth. Civil rights movement beginning. In the late 1950s, governmental segregation across the United States, especially in the South, was increasingly challenged by the growing civil rights movement. African American leaders such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. led the Montgomery bus boycott, which began the movement. For years, African Americans faced violence against them, but made great strides towards social justice through Supreme Court decisions, including cases such as Brown versus Board of Education and Loving v. Virginia, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which ended Jim Crow laws that had legalized racial segregation between whites and blacks. Yasti Atal. 144. Duncan West talks with Cesar Chavez. Duncan represents the Teamsters Union. Martin Luther King Jr., who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on racial justice, was assassinated in 1968. After his death, others continued to lead the movement, most notably his widow, Coretta Scott King. She was also active against the Vietnam War like her husband and was involved in the women's liberation movement. During the first 9 months of 1967, 128 American cities suffered 164 riots, 145. The Black Power movement emerged in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The decade ultimately brought positive results toward racial integration, especially in government services, sports, and entertainment. Native Americans turned to the courts to assert their land rights. They organized protests to highlight the federal government's failure to enforce treaties. One of the most active Native American groups was the American Indian Movement, AIM. In the 1960s, Cesar Chavez began organizing low-wage Mexican-American farm workers in California. He led a 5-year Great Picker Strike. Chavez then founded the nation's first successful farm worker union, which later became the United Farm Workers, UFW. Women's movement Gloria Steinem at a Women's Action Coalition meeting. 1972. A new awareness of the inequality of American women began to sweep the nation with the publication of Betty Friedan's best-selling book in 1963. The book, titled The Feminine Mystique, explained why many housewives felt isolated and unfulfilled, and attacked American culture for creating the notion that women could find fulfillment only through their roles as wives, mothers, and homemakers, and that women were as capable as men of doing everything. In 1966, Friedan and others founded the National Organization for Women, NOW, to do for women what the NAACP had done for African Americans. 109. 46. Protests began. The women's liberation movement grew rapidly in numbers and strength, gaining much media attention. By 1968, it had replaced the civil rights movement as the major social revolution in the United States. Marches, parades, protest rallies, boycotts, and picketing brought together thousands, sometimes millions of people. Women gained encouraging numbers in the medical, legal, and business professions, but few were elected to elected office. However, the movement soon split into ideological factions: the left-wing National Organization for Women, the right-wing Women's Equality Action League, the center-right National Women's Political Party, and more radical groups formed by young women on the far left. The Equal Rights Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed by Congress in 1972, but a conservative coalition led by Phyllis Schlafly lobbied hard to defeat it at the state level. An amendment must be ratified by 2/3 of the states before it can take effect. Conservatives argued that the amendment degraded the status of housewives and made young women vulnerable to military recruitment. 147. 148. However, Many federal laws, state laws, and Supreme Court decisions have created equal status for women under the law. Social habits and consciousness began to change to accept women's equal rights. The controversial issue of abortion, which the Supreme Court declared a fundamental right in the Roe v. Wade case, 1973, remains a point of debate to this day. Haitef 149, Countercultural Revolution and Cold War détente. During the Cold War, the United States entered the Vietnam War, which was increasingly opposed by Americans. The war fueled existing social movements, women's, minorities, and youth. Lyndon B. Johnson's grand social programs and numerous Supreme Court decisions helped to increase the scope of social reform throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Feminism and the environmental movement became political forces. Progress continued toward democracy for all Americans. The counterculture revolution swept the country and much of the Western world in the late 1960s and early 1970s, further dividing Americans in a culture war, but also bringing more open and liberal social views. 150, a U.S. Navy F-4 Phantom II tracks a Soviet Tu-95 Bear D aircraft in the early 1970s. Republican Richard Nixon succeeded Lyndon B. Johnson in 1960. Nixon handed responsibility for the war to South Vietnamese forces and ended the American combat role. He negotiated the 1973 Paris Peace Accords, reached agreement on the return of prisoners of war, and ended conscription. The war cost 58,000 American soldiers their lives. Nixon created intense distrust between the Soviet Union and China to the United States' advantage, achieving a reduction in tensions, known as the détente strategy, with both countries. The Watergate scandal involved Nixon's cover-up of a break-in by his staff of the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Inside the Watergate complex, which devastated his geopolitical base, sent several aides to prison, and forced him to resign as president on August 9, 1974. Vice President Gerald Ford took over, but was ultimately powerless to prevent the collapse of the Saigon government. When the Republic of South Vietnam entered Saigon in 1975, as well as communist victories in neighboring Cambodia and Laos that same year, the OPEC oil embargo marked a long transition period as, for the first time, oil prices rose sharply. American manufacturers faced stiff competition from foreign consumer goods, electronics, and automobiles. By the late 1970s, the economy was experiencing an energy crisis, slow economic growth, high unemployment, and very high inflation, accompanied by high interest rates. As economists agreed on the wisdom of economic deregulation, many of the New Deal regulations were ended, such as in transportation, banking, and telecommunications. Jimmy Carter, a non-Washington political outsider, was elected president in 1976, 153. On the world stage, Carter brokered the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. In 1979, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 66 Americans hostage, triggering the Iran hostage crisis. The hostage crisis and the prolonged economic stagnation, coupled with inflation, caused Carter to lose the 1980 presidential election to Republican Ronald Reagan. 154. On January 20, 1981, minutes after Carter's term ended, the remaining American hostages held in the U.S. Embassy in Iran were released, ending the 444-day hostage crisis, closing the 20th century Ronald Reagan at the Brandenburg Gate challenging Gorbas. Ronald Reagan brought about a major political change through his two landslide presidential elections in 1980 and 1984. Reagan's economic policies, known as Reaganomics, along with the implementation of the Tax Reform and Economic Recovery Act of 1981, lowered the income tax rate from 70% to 28% over a 7-year period. 156. Reagan continued to reduce government regulations and tax collection. 157. The United States experienced a brief economic crisis in 1982, but the negative figures were reversed as inflation fell from 11% to 2%. Unemployment fell from 10.8% in December 1982 to 7.5% in November 1984, or 158, and economic growth increased from 4.5% to 7.2%. While 159, Reagan ordered a massive buildup of the United States military, which added to the budget deficit. Reagan introduced a complex missile defense system known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. Detractors nicknamed it Star Wars, in which the United States could theoretically shoot down missiles with a space-based laser system. Although the system was never fully developed or deployed, the Soviet Union was deeply concerned about the program's potential effectiveness and became more willing to negotiate. Reagan's rollback policy of weakening communist states in key regions included covert support and funding of anti-communist resistance movements around the world. Reagan's interventions against Grenada and Libya were popular in the United States, although his support for the Contra rebels was embroiled in the Iran-Contra scandal, which exposed Reagan's poor management style. Reagan met with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev 4 times. Their summits resulted in the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Gorbachev sought to save communism in the Soviet Union first by ending the costly arms race with the United States, 162, then by shrinking the Eastern European Empire in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, ending the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The NASDAQ Composite Index inflated with the dot-com bubble during the optimistic new economy. The dot-com bubble burst in 2000. The United States became the world's sole remaining superpower and continued to intervene in international affairs during the 1990s, including the 1991 Gulf War against Iraq. After being elected president in August 1992, Bill Clinton oversaw one of the longest periods of economic expansion and unprecedented stock market appreciation, a side effect of the digital revolution and new business opportunities created by the Internet. He also worked with the Republican-controlled United States Congress to pass the first balanced federal budget in 30 years. In 1998, Clinton was impeached by the United States House of Representatives on charges of lying about his sexual relationship with White House intern Monica Lewinsky, but was later acquitted by the United States Senate. The failure to impeach Clinton and the Democratic gains in Congress in the 1998 elections forced House Speaker Newt Gingrich, a Republican, to resign from Congress. The 2000 presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore was one of the closest presidential elections in U.S. history and helped sow the seeds of political polarization to come. The decisive Florida election was extremely close and resulted in a spectacular vote count dispute. The U.S. Supreme Court had to intervene in the Bush versus Gore dispute to end the recount with a 5-4 result. This meant that Bush, who was leading at the time, won Florida and the presidential election. First Century, September 11th and the War on Terror main article, September 11th terrorist attacks. The September 11th terrorist attacks led to the War on Terror on September 11, 2001. The United States suffered a terrorist attack when 19 hijackers from the militant group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 passenger planes and deliberately crashed them into the 2 towers of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, killing nearly 3,000 people, most of them civilians, AD 165. In retaliation on September 20th, President George W. Bush declared a war on terror. On October 7, 2001, the United States and NATO invaded Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban regime for providing sanctuary to the militant group, Al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden. The federal government established new domestic efforts to prevent future attacks. The controversial USA Patriot Act increased the government's powers to monitor communications and removed legal restrictions on information sharing between federal intelligence and law enforcement agencies. A cabinet-level agency called the Department of Homeland Security was created to lead and coordinate the federal government's counterterrorism efforts. Some of these counterterrorism efforts, particularly the government's detention of detainees at the Guantanamo Bay detention facility, led to accusations of human rights violations by the federal government. In 2003, the United States launched an invasion of Iraq, leading to the collapse of the Iraqi government and the eventual capture of dictator Saddam Hussein. The Bush administration's justifications for invading Iraq included the spread of democracy, the elimination of weapons of mass destruction, 168, also a key demand of the United Nations, although later investigations found no evidence that intelligence reports were accurate, 169, and the liberation of the Iraqi people. Despite some initial successes early in the invasion, the protracted Iraq War sparked international protests and gradually domestic support for the war declined as many Americans began to question whether the invasion was worth it. 170. 171. In 2007, after years of violence by Iraqi insurgents, President Bush deployed additional troops in a strategy dubbed the Surge. Although the death toll decreased, Iraq's political stability remained in doubt. In 2008, the loss of support for President Bush and the Iraq War, coupled with the 2008 financial crisis, led to the election of Barack Obama, the first African-American President of the United States. After the election, Obama reluctantly continued the troop surge, sending an additional 20,000 troops to Iraq until Iraq was stabilized. He then officially ended combat operations in Iraq on August 31, 2010, but kept 50,000 in Iraq to support Iraqi forces, help protect withdrawing U.S. forces, and conduct counterterrorism operations. On December 15, 2011, the war was officially declared over and the last troops left Iraq. 175. At the same time, Obama increased American involvement in Afghanistan, initiating a surge strategy with an additional 30,000 troops while offering to begin withdrawing at a later date. On the Guantanamo Bay issue, President Obama banned torture, but generally continued Bush's policy on prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, while also suggesting that the prison be gradually closed. On May 15, 2011, after nearly a decade in hiding, Al-Qaeda founder and leader Osama bin Laden was killed in a bunker in Pakistan, detected by a Malinois dog, in a raid by U.S. Navy SEALs on the direct orders of President Obama. While Al-Qaeda has largely collapsed in Afghanistan, its affiliates continue to operate in Yemen and other remote areas. To counter these activities, the CIA uses drones to find and kill the leaders of these groups. The Great Depression and Recent Events main article, Great Depression, Lehman Brothers, headquarters pictured, filed for bankruptcy in September 2008 at a Matzak, the height of the U.S. financial crisis. In December 2007, the United States and much of Europe entered the longest economic crisis since World War II, thus commonly known as the Great Recession, Part 80. Multiple overlapping crises occurred, most notably a housing market crisis caused by the subprime mortgage crisis, high oil prices that triggered a crisis in the auto industry, high unemployment, and the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The financial crisis threatened the stability of the entire economy in September 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed and other major banks went into distress. 181.1. Beginning in October, the federal government lent $245 billion to financial institutions through the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which was passed by bipartisan majorities and signed by Bush. As the recession worsened, Barack Obama, running on a platform of change and opposing the unpopular policies of incumbent President Bush, was elected president with the help of a coalition of voters that included large proportions of African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, women, and young voters, as well as traditional Democratic voters. He was re-elected in 2012 with the support of a similar coalition, as demographics also showed that the Republican base was aging and shrinking. Hispanic and Asian American voters were growing rapidly and increasingly shifting their support to the Democratic coalition. 184. Shortly after taking office as president in January 2009, Obama signed into law the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. This was a $787 billion economic stimulus package intended to help the economy recover from the deep recession. Obama, like Bush, took steps to save the auto industry and prevent future economic downturns. These steps included bailing out General Motors and Chrysler, placing the companies under temporary federal ownership, and implementing a cash-for-dump program to temporarily boost new car sales. 185. The recession officially ended in June 2009, and the economy has slowly begun to expand again since then. President Barack Obama signs the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, commonly known as Obamacare. In addition to dealing with the economic crisis, the 111th Congress passed major legislation such as the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act 187, and the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Repeal Act. All of these bills were signed into law by President Obama. 188. Following the 2010 midterm elections, in which Republicans controlled the House of Representatives and Democrats controlled the Senate, 189, the United States Congress experienced a period of high gridlock and heated debate over whether to raise the debt ceiling, extend tax breaks for citizens earning over $250,000 a year, and other key issues. 190. These ongoing debates led to President Obama signing the Budget Control Act of 2011 and the American Taxpayer Relief Act of 2012, resulting in temporary budget cuts that took effect in March 2013, as well as tax increases, primarily on the wealthy. As a result of rising public discontent with both parties in Congress during this period, congressional approval ratings fell to an average of 15% in Gallup polls from 2012 to 13, the lowest on record, and below the 33% average from 1974 to 2013. 191. Other events that occurred in the 2010s included the rise of new political movements around the world, such as the Conservative Tea Party in the United States and the popular international Occupy movement. There was also unusually severe weather in the summer of 2012, which left more than half of the United States in a record drought. Hurricane Sandy caused severe damage to the coastal areas of New York and New Jersey in late October. The debate over gay rights, most notably same-sex marriage, began to shift in favor of same-sex couples. This was reflected in dozens of public opinion polls released early in the decade,